Well, welcome to At Home at Highclere for Viking.TV this Friday. Thank you to everyone who watched last week, and thank you for all your questions. And I hope you are at your computers now, putting them across to Viking so I can answer them later on. I think you might know where I'm standing. It's obviously the dining room, and we think it's Highclere Castle's dining room. But so many of you have watched Downton Abbey, I think you also think it's Downton Abbey. It's a very good Friday to be talking in this room, because of course on April the 12th in 1912, the Titanic sank, and that was the first telegram that was delivered into this very room in Downton Abbey, and it began the whole phenomenon that we've so enjoyed for 6 years on television, and then of course the film. It's April the 10th today, so in actual fact it's 2 days' time, 108 or so years ago. I'm an accountant, so I can't add if I've got that wrong. But thank you for joining me today. So many scenes from Downton Abbey took place in this room. It was often set for about 14 of the cast, and it was covered in a white tablecloth, although this in fact is our table, which they used as their table, and our chairs, which they used as their chairs. Today you're looking at our silver, not their silver, in case they lost our silver, and it's our place settings, which I'm going to tell you and share with you a little bit later. I think so much action took place in this room that it's become very familiar to all of you. Maggie Smith had fish spilt on her lap. I think Jim Carter as Mr. Carson fell over just here. Obviously Hugh Bonneville as Lord Grantham had a most unfortunate scene with his ulcer. And actually many of the dinner parties or lunch parties didn't go that well. From our point of view, watching them film, they were sitting in here for some 11 hours to get 5.5 minutes view on television. There would be the 14 people around the table, and then 40 or 50 crew, usually dressed in their black trousers and black jackets and black cloth boots. All the windows would be open, it'd be freezing cold. The cast would look simply beautiful, but they'd have lots of Ugg boots and where possible rugs all across their knees. Because they'd begin filming in February and it is quite cold. And in order to keep the cold out, we shut the windows, which of course Downton Abbey opened. But so it's a wonderful room, and in actual fact, it has welcomed statesmen, politicians, royalty, so many people, men and women from the world of letters and music. And we still eat in here today. At the moment we don't actually, the castle is very much closed up in this extraordinary, challenging time which we're all facing and following our journeys through. But we've set it for you today to show how it might look if we were having a small lunch or dinner party. But before I return to that, I'd like to tell you something about the paintings in this room, because it is an extraordinary room for the portraits and the works of art. And one of the most important ones is this wonderful painting of King Charles I on horseback by Anthony van Dyck. It was painted by, in about 1634, forgive me, it was painted about 1634, 1635, and there are several versions of this painting. The Queen has one, and we've got one. I think there's one in Warwick Castle. So it was done as a homage. So if Charles I was coming to stay with you, you knew you would pay him homage and do him much honour. It has hung here since about the 18th century, we think, and before that it was hung in Geordie's relative's house. The painting is actually very important because it really records the divine right of kings. You're just looking at the face of Charles I. All the angles of the painting make you want to admire his face. The divine right of kings, he could raise taxes, he could raise the army, and he had executive control, and he had authority to do what he wished, when he wished. During the years 1641 to 1647, there was the most terrible civil war in this country. And in fact, I've got a few things to show you from that. There's some coins here, a groat, which I think we'll try and share with Viking and put on the website. There's fourpence here. You've got Charles I's head on one side and the other. And then this is a really interesting coin. It's only a penny, but there's actually a hole through one part of the coin, because this coin was then, if you like, destroyed, if you like, after Charles I was executed. So it both relates to before and after the execution of Charles I in 1649. He's the only British king to have been executed, and after that came Cromwell's reign with the parliamentarians. And after his execution, the ability of the monarch to raise taxes and raise an army passed forever from their hands, and it passed into the hands of Parliament. Forgive me, I'm going to try one of my own glasses of water. So whilst you think these are Lord Grantham relatives, they're not. That is the first Earl of Carnarvon up there. It's a wonderful painting with wonderful flowing blonde locks, and he died fighting for Charles I at the First Battle of Newbury on September the 18th, 1643, and his wife, which is a small Van Dyke, hangs underneath him. To the other side is his brother-in-law, also a very much ardent royalist, and going round the room, there are all the royalists who are supporting Charles I in his endeavours. Of course, in the end, they then had to all step back and try to survive during the era of Cromwell, and this painting was taken down and it was rolled up and it propped up a barn door. We then move on to my husband Geordie's direct grandfather ancestor, a man called Sir Robert Sawyer. Sir Robert Sawyer was Attorney General for Charles II, Charles I's eldest son, who after the time of Cromwell and the parliamentarians came back and he became king here once more. Sir Robert Sawyer was quite close to the king, and when King Charles II moved out of London towards the end of his reign and was trying to build his own version of Versailles at Winchester, which he never finished, Robert Sawyer decided to buy an estate near him, but not too near. And this estate, Highclere, had passed out of church hands. It was for sale, and he bought it. So he bought a red brick place house, as it was called, and he began work immediately to refurbish it. He rebuilt the church. It was a 12th century church which was falling apart. So he rebuilt that again in about 1679, 1680. And he lived here, and he left it to his daughter, Margaret Sawyer's son, Robert Herbert. So that is how the house came into my husband's family. So he's really only been in for 350 years. The church, of course, held it for 800 years. Sometimes it's quite fun to tell him he's very nouveau, which of course he isn't at all, so Steve might be watching this. But moving on, my other painting I'd like to talk about is another first Earl of Carnarvon. The first Earl of Carnarvon I already referenced had a son, and then had therefore a grandson, who died in the plague that swept through England in 1665. The plague was in fact wiped out by the Great Fire, which we know from our history was 1666, and the title died out. So when Geordie's ancestor, the Colonel Henry Herbert, was offered a title by George III, he thought he'd look back and see what another ancestor of his, a relative of his, had held already. And he also became the first Earl of Carnarvon. And Geordie and I have got to number 8. It's a wonderful painting. He was given the earldom by George III. George III, you might remember if you've seen the musical Hamilton, which I have and I love. And in the middle of it, I think George III in Hamilton completely steals the show. And actually, he also gave Geordie's ancestor his title. So he's, I think, pointing at his papers, saying, this is what I've done, so I've been awarded. He's wearing his ermine robes, because he's now going to sit in the House of Lords. What's quite interesting is this painting was begun by Thomas Gainsborough, but actually it was finished by Gilbert Stuart, who painted George Washington on the dollar bill. So Gilbert Stuart spent about 17 years living in this country, coming and going, before finally returning to America. And so it's the same sort of posture as perhaps the famous one of George Washington, and I'm thrilled to have that connection. We have another George Washington connection because my husband's grandmother, Geordie's grandmother, is American, and she's descended partly from Robert E. Lee's family, and of course that relates to Martha Washington. So I do have a very precious letter signed by Martha Washington in our archives, which has come down through that side of the family, as well as some invitations to the White House and some other very interesting small scraps of paper or letters from that time. So that is the story of the first Earl of Carnarvon, and it's set within the most beautiful carved frame. So this is Lord Grantham's dining room, this is our dining room, and they don't really change much when they come here as Downton Abbey. I've picked some flowers from the garden today, which I wish you could smell the scent. It's so lovely. It's some narcissi and tulips and some cherry blossom and some huge parrot tulips, which my husband loved and has planted in the garden, with some early flowering Philadelphus for the green leaves. So it's a complete joy to pick back and put it on the table today. So that's the centerpiece for this number of people. Louis, I think, would set the table far better than I, so please, Louis, our own butler, our own Mr. Castle, forgive me. But it's set for 6, and I've used some brown mats underneath these white tablecloths. If I sit down here, you can perhaps see a little bit more clearly some of the table setting. There's a brown mat, so if the plates are hot, it doesn't hurt the table. Then we've had these, Geordie and I have these white linen table placemats made with a crown for the sea, Comer's Carnarvon, House of Carnarvon in the corner, with a crest. The napkin goes on top, and then here are the knives and forks and the spoon. So the prospect of supper is looking very good. Sadly, Paul is not in the kitchen, so it's going to be me cooking tonight, and not for here, sadly. Obviously, in Downton Abbey, the cook in the kitchen was Mrs. Packmore, Leslie Nichol, and she's also become a great friend, and so she sat here and had dinner with us, stayed for weekends, and Paul has cooked for Mrs. Packmore, which is quite fun. And Leslie very kindly sent in a question. "Hello there," says Leslie. "I imagine my fellow chef Paul has had to leave you and go home along with all the other staff. Please send love to them and to you and the family." And she's right, because Paul and the other chefs are no longer here. Paul lives in the park, but he's not coming in. He's also been furloughed until we can restart the propeller of Highclere Castle and get the whole business going a little bit again. So Paul and Louis are the equivalents of Mrs. Patmore and Carson. They bring the food up from the kitchen, which is miles away, along a corridor, round another corner, along another corridor, round another corner, up some stairs into the back of the servery, and then eventually to the dining room table. In Downton Abbey, the food arrives from Ealing Studios, so it's even cleverer, and then 2 weeks later the same plate with wonderful continuity is then brought by Thomas Barrow or Mr. Carson into the dining room. So it's a wonderful muddle, the way Highclere and Downton Abbey and all the different characters come together and sit and enjoy dinner around the dining room. We've also welcomed Hugh and Lady Bonneville, as he is Lord Grantham, so I've had Lord Grantham and Lord Carnarvon and Mrs. Patmore all sitting at the same table, which is perhaps a bit more muddling for our staff team than anybody else, and perhaps mesmerising for our fellow guests. But I think it's important to have laughter and fun and try to share with them how this house really works, because I think that sense of place and that authenticity, which I think Highclere helps give Julian Fellows' wonderful scripts, makes Downton Abbey so engaging for all of you. In the film, of course, of Downton Abbey, which we so enjoyed last year, it seems an age ago, doesn't it? Quite a few of the scenes were again set in this dining room, and there was one very wonderful scene when there was a royal visit. We've been most fortunate that Highclere over the centuries has in fact welcomed royalty to this house, and when such a visit takes place there is a lot of running around, a lot of excitement, quite a lot of panicking before hopefully the whole weekend comes together. And you saw much the same on Downton Abbey, and they came and sat at the dining room table with Lord and Lady Grantham, who in Downton Abbey, I think Lord Grantham sits here and Lady Grantham that side. In fact, in Highclere or Downton Abbey, I sit here and my husband sits there. And in the royal visit, obviously, the King was sitting next to Lady Grantham and the Queen next to Lord Grantham. At the end of the dining room scenes in Downton Abbey, I think was one of my most favourite moments, and I hope you all really enjoyed it. It was, of course, the Molesley curtsy, and there he was. It had gone so well. He was so overexcited that he did this most elaborate, wonderful curtsy, nearly falling over. And I cried with laughter. I hope you all did as well. So on that note of laughs and laughter, I think I'm going to end today's talk, and I would like to move on to all the questions which I hope you've been sending in. And we've also got a few questions, first of all, to answer from last week. So thank you for tuning into this segment, and please stay with us for the most engaging part, is when I can converse and answer all your questions.
Thank you, Lady Carnarvon. So first we've got a question from Julie, who lives in Toronto. She asks, is there any way to watch last week's episode once the live streaming has actually passed?
That's probably my most testing question. I'm quite good on history tapes, but I can tell if you go onto Viking.TV and look at conversations with Karina Hagen is my greatest friend, and we're giving each other virtual hugs, but we're countries apart. And she set up conversations with Karina, and in there I hope you'll find last week's piece when I was in the library.
Thank you. Jean from Cape Cod also asks, do you allow tours at Highclere?
Oh, we do allow tours. Thank you so much for asking. You might not know it at the moment, given obviously we're playing, we're doing almost nothing at the moment, waiting until we can restart, and we all managed to interrupt the course of this virus, but we're very much hoping to offer some small tours again in the autumn and in the late summer and towards Christmas. And we think we'll keep our numbers lower. We've got quite a lot of space and some wonderful gardens to share, which I hope will be really restorative after this really challenging, terrible time we're all going through in every single country.
Adding to this, Fred from Kansas is asking, do you have any tours with overnight guests?
Fred, you can't stay here, but we have two lodges, Grotto Lodge and London Lodge, and they are so cute. Grotto Lodge is high in the hill amongst the bluebell woods, which are about to come out. And I think it's got one of the best views, I'd like to say in the country, but certainly around here, looking north towards Oxford. It's a little round tower, basically, which has now got 2 double bedrooms. And I hope, again, offers peace and quiet, tranquility, a great place to walk from, and a great place to visit the castle from. There's another one, London Lodge, as well. So do look on our website and do come and stay with us. It'd be wonderful to welcome you.
Lady Carnarvon, we now have a question from Nancy, who lives in New Jersey. Have you spoken with Maggie Smith?
Nancy, I have spoken with Maggie Smith because effectively she was here, we were living here for some 6 years during the TV series and then during the film. The film was really only shot over 2 months and then was probably around about 2 hours of enjoyment for us all to watch. The TV series was some 6 years of filming, which was 17.5 hours on television. So the cast and crew were here a huge amount of the time, and it was a joy to have met Maggie Smith, who's an amazing British icon. And actually we've also, George and I have worked with Mary Berry, who is also an extraordinary British icon, so that was a complete pleasure.
You mentioned this briefly earlier, but Richard from Maryland asks, did the Downton Abbey production use the actual furniture during the filming, or was it replaced with replicas?
No, well, Downton Abbey did, particularly in this room. They hardly changed anything. As I said, it was this dining room table. I think they put their own cloths. We also have cloths, and they used our chairs, the sideboards are the same, they're ours. And I think they hardly changed anything in here, apart from the fact they tended to use fake flowers because that helped their continuity. Although I think sometimes in the film, because it was again a shorter timing frame, they used the magnificent real flowers, which were a joy to admire, basically.
Eric, now from Southern California, has loved reading your books such as Lady Almina and Lady Catherine. Do you have any further books that you're planning to write about Highclere?
Thank you. Yes, I enjoyed writing Almina. It's the first history book I'd ever written, and I think I found it utterly immersive writing it, because I was writing it about the First World War when Downton Abbey were filming the First World War, and I'd been floods of tears reading some of the letters from the archives, walk out of my study to find one of the Downton Abbey extras with their head bandaged or something walking towards me, and I almost burst into tears when I saw them and needed a cup of tea. So I wrote that one. Then Catherine takes this house into the Second World War. I then wrote At Home at Highclere and then Christmas at Highclere, and I'm actually really looking forward to Christmas at Highclere. I think we all are looking forward to perhaps the later part of this year. And I do have plans for my next book, but I'm going to hopefully share them with the publishers next week, and then perhaps I can tell you about it, which I'm quite excited about.
Lady Carnarvon, we now have a lot of questions about the lady in the portrait to your left. So one particular one is from Debbie from New York City. Who is the woman in the blue dress in the painting by the door?
This painting here, I'm glad you can see it on the camera, is of Margaret Sawyer. Margaret Sawyer was the only daughter of Robert Sawyer. So Margaret Sawyer is Geordie's however many greats grandmother. And when, in Sir Robert Sawyer, her father's will, he left this estate to her second son, Robert Sawyer Herbert. Her eldest son inherited Wilton. Her husband is above the door, the Earl of Pembroke. She became the Countess of Pembroke. They lived at the most amazing house, Geordie's cousin's house, Wilton House. The eldest son inherited that, and through his will I actually got the original copy of Sir Robert Sawyer's will, in which he gives this house to his wife for her lifetime, and then to his grandson, Robert Herbert. We're never supposed to move the painting. So when my mother-in-law redecorated this room, it was gingerly held out, because otherwise it's supposed to bring bad luck on the house. So nobody ever moves that painting. But she's a very beautiful woman, and she had a huge dowry, and she's very much part of the history of this house.
Thank you. Now Kathy from North Carolina is asking, are the flowers grown in a greenhouse or your own garden?
Kathy, these flowers were from all over the garden. I took the dogs for a walk today, and I took my trug and scissors and was chatting with a girlfriend who came with me about the gift shop, which we're trying to put more online. So I was picking the flowers for you and walking the dogs all at once. But it was such a joy to collect them. So I was just looking to collect white flowers. These are some big white parrot tulips here, which are wonderful. There's some sage, there's some cherry blossoms, some narcissi. So it was what I saw as I went on my walk today, and it's come back. So thank you for asking.
Judy from Delaware is asking, are there any plans to have special events at Highclere to commemorate the 100th anniversary of King Tut's excavation?
Yes, thank you. I'm actually, one of the books I do wish to write is the first ever biography of the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. So that was Geordie's great-grandfather, and he was the one who discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun with Howard Carter in 1922. And you know, no one's written his biography. So I have created a room called Orient upstairs. It's painted this amazing colour of Paris yellow, and I'm beginning to collect all the archives and all my research together in it. It's a big project, so it's spinning around in my head, and I'm very much looking forward to writing that, and then taking forward to see how perhaps I can work with some of the other partners, collaborators in the team which Lord Carnarvon put together to curate and look after the tomb of Tutankhamun when he discovered it, being the Metropolitan Museum of New York, and obviously the British Museum, the Ashmolean by Oxford, and I've been talking to the Noise Museum in Berlin and Professor Lepper, a girlfriend of mine who works there, to see where we can go. And I'd also like to involve the Louvre. I think it's such an extraordinary asset to all humanity in terms of the culture it shares. So I would like to do something jointly if I can.
Now, Betty from America is asking, how often do you and Lord Carnarvon dine with a large group in the dining room?
Bethany, every so often we have weekends, such as you see on Downton Abbey, for our friends, because you can't work all the time looking after a museum, it needs to be a home. So scattered through the year, normally, we gather some friends together, maybe around a concert or a weekend in March to go and see the Spring Lambs, or some other event, the church fete, or something like that. And it's fun to fill the house, to hear the laughter, to see the light coming from under the door as people are changing, and then to come down and share cocktails, gin cocktails of course, or some champagne, and then begin to sit down and spend a lovely meal together, eating, swapping news, the conversation flowing. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's all those social interactions which are so hard for us to cope with at the moment, given we're so isolated from each other.
Lady Carnarvon, we now have a question from Karen, who's in Kentucky. What are you serving for Easter dinner?
I have already bought a leg of lamb to butterfly, and then to stuff with perhaps some olives or some apricots. I've got to see what I've got in the pantry here, because I'm not going to go shopping again, but I thought it'd be really nice to stuff a leg of lamb and probably make some potato dauphinoise, and I was going to put that recipe up on my Instagram actually as a way of sharing it. So traditionally we have lamb at Easter. We would normally go to church, come back and have Sunday lunch, but we're not going to be going to church, so perhaps we're going to be saying some prayers together at home and reflecting a little bit before we then sit down and have a delicious lunch. Maybe I have to hide some Easter eggs or something, but then I'll probably know where to find them. We normally have an Easter egg hunt in aid of the Murray Parish Trust, which is a great charity supporting a local hospital, Southampton Hospital. But again, that's been delayed. We've tried to put it forward towards July, because we hope running around the gardens for a summer trail will be restored or next year. So like every other business, we're trying to reschedule, offer alternatives, but again, try to support some of the charities who are also, whose incomes have completely evaporated.
We now have a question from Robin, who lives in Georgia. What happens to all the wool from the sheep?
Well, sadly, nothing much happens to the wool from the sheep, because it doesn't seem to have much value in this country. Some might go to carpets, but actually I've just found a company, a family business in Wales, and I thought I might see if they could make me some rugs, because I reckon people might wish to buy some rugs made from Highclere Castle wool. So that's one of my latest ideas. Thank you.
Constantine from California is asking, thank you for this wonderful show. It's amazing that this place still exists after all the plagues, fires and wars. How do you feel about being responsible for such a beautiful castle?
Well, thank you very much. It is amazing sometimes that we are still here actually, and after the First and Second World War in particular in this country, so many houses disappeared, and I think 1,000 stately homes were demolished in the sort of 10 years after the Second World War. It is so hard to hang on to them. And at the moment, given the world we're in, I'm hardly looking very far ahead. I'm going step by step as we all go through this time, and then hope again we can revert to looking a little bit further up, thinking about the tours. You know, we might all be very lucky, and maybe they might do another Downton film. That would be wonderful, and I think a great escape for all of us. I'd like to write more books, and again I think that then works into all the social media. And of course, one of the business enterprises that Geordie and I have undertaken is to create a Highclere Castle gin. So it's looking at our brand and seeing how we can leverage it and thereby support this castle in a way without visitors necessarily coming here, because we can only have so many visitors per day, and it is a very large enterprise in terms of its fixed overheads. And it's also what you all don't see, but I'd love to share with you. We have one of the oldest medieval barns in southern England. It dates from at least 1438, or that's when it was rebuilt. And we're trying to restore it and look after it. So much of the work that we do in terms of heritage, you don't see, but we still try to do our best and undertake it. So there's always money going out. So we're trying to think of other ways, like all of you, of persuading money to come in.
Perhaps our final question is from Tiffany in Pennsylvania. What is the history of the ornately carved mantle beneath the portrait of Charles I? Just behind you.
Yes, well, just behind me, this is actually just a Victorian, sideboard, and in Downton Abbey, if you remember, they used to have their breakfast served on it, but it was never hot. You'd never put your chafing dishes underneath an oil by Van Dyke. We always put ours the other end, and we would normally put some silver and some flowers on it. So it makes a really wonderful fitting setting underneath the portrait of Charles I. Thank you so much for all your questions. I'm looking forward very much to seeing you next week. Next week I'm going to be in the saloon, and I wanted to share some of that particular room with you. It's what Downton Abbey calls the Great Hall, but actually it's the saloon, it's the heart of the house, an extraordinary piece of architecture by Sir Charles Barry. And I also thought I could then make sure I catch up on any of your questions. And I'm so looking forward to saying hello and talking to you next week. Thank you for joining me on At Home on Viking TV on a Friday. Thank you.